In my previous video, I showed you how to create a simple to-do app that ran on the desktop, and I covered how to create components and manage application state. And so in this video, I want to show you how to create a simple blog app using Dioxus's full stack feature to run on the web. Now, initially I had planned to show you the development as well as the deployment, but I'm going to leave the deployment for another video, and I'll explain why towards the end of the video. Okay, so let's go ahead and create our Dioxus application, and I'm going to do that by typing in dx new and then blog to create our blog application. Now for all the options here, I'm just going to go ahead and select the default, so it's going to be a bare bones application, and notice that I'm going to select false for full stack, and then finally I'm going to select web for the platform. So now Dioxus has generated our application. Let's go ahead and open it up. Now in this video, we're not going to focus so much on the UI. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste in some CSS code that I've already written, and I'm also going to update main.rs with some components that I've already put together. Now these components simply render UI elements, so it will give us a foundation to start with. So if we go ahead and compile the app now, we can see what the UI currently looks like. So to compile the app, we're going to use dxserve, and since we are using the web platform, Dioxus is going to give us an IP address and a port number to connect to. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and then paste it into a browser. So this is what our UI currently looks like, and you'll notice two things. First is that my creativity level is most definitely at a -1. But jokes aside, you'll notice that we have a left column with the create post button and some static links. And then on the right side, we have another column that consists of a input field that will capture our post title and a text area for the post body. And there's also a post button that we're going to use to submit those details to a backend server. Now there's also a third column which you can't see, and this column is going to be used to show the list of posts that we create. So the first thing that we're going to do is wire up the UI so that by default we're going to see a list of posts, and only when we click on the create post button will we see the create post form. And to do this, we're going to create a toggle switch. Now before we start writing any code, let's take a look at some of the components that make up the UI. So to start with, we have the app component, and this is the primary component that Dioxus will use to launch the app. And the app component simply loads our CSS style sheet, and it also calls the main component. And if we take a look at the main component, we can see that the main component is loading the menu component, the post entry component, and the posts component. So what we want to do here is create a toggle switch that is either going to show the post entry component or the post component. And we're going to do that by using a Boolean state. So here I've created a Boolean state called toggle post form using the useSignals function. Now if you saw my last video on how to create a to-do list app, you'll recall that Dioxus has several hooks for managing state, and one of those hooks is the useSignals function. So in this case, we're going to use the useSignals function to create a Boolean state that we're going to use as a toggle switch. Now that we have this state, we can write an if statement in the rsx macro to determine which component to load. So if the toggle post form is set to true, we're going to show the post entry component. Otherwise, we're going to show the post component. Now this code isn't going to do anything at the moment because the state of toggle post form is always going to be set to false. So what we need to do is we need to move that state into the menu component where the create post button is. So all we have to do now is add an on-click event handler on the create post button, and the goal is that when we click on this button, we want to change the value of toggle post form from true to false or from false to true, and we're going to do this using an if statement. Okay, so before moving any further, let's go ahead and test this code to make sure it's working. So here you can see that the post entry form is no longer showing, and what's actually showing is the list of posts, but we don't have any posts at the moment, so nothing's going to display. Now, if I click on the create post button, we should see the post entry form appear. So that's working fine. And if I click on the button again, it should go back to its default view. So that's working fine too. But we should really change the text of the button so that when we're viewing a post entry form, rather than the button saying create post, it should say something like go back. So let's go ahead and make that change. So this is a simple change to make. All we have to do is wrap the text content around an if statement so that if toggle post form is true, we're going to show back. Otherwise, we're going to show create post. So let's move on now to capture user input. And we're going to do this by creating two states, one to hold the post title and the other to hold the post body. And both of these states are going to be of type string. And now we need to pass the post title and the post body states to the post entry component, because this component contains the text fields for both the post title and the post body. And then we can use the onInput handler for each of the text fields to capture the user data being entered and store them into each of the states. And we need to do this because we need to gain access to the post title and the post body when we click on the post button. And because there's no getElementById function or query selector, there's no other way to get this data. And so by using the onInput handler, we can capture the data that's being entered and put that into each of the states, and then we can access the states from within the post button. Okay, so up until now we've been writing client-side code, and it's now time to submit the post data to a backend server. Now we can do this in one of two ways. We can create and manage a separate backend server using a framework like Axum, or we can use Dioxus's full stack feature. For this video, we're going to use Dioxus's full stack feature because I want to show you how to write client-side code alongside server-side code. But in a separate video, I'm going to put together a project where we'll use Dioxus as the client side and Axum as the backend server. So let's move on and create our first server function. To create a server function, we need to use a server macro, and all server functions must be asynchronous. So I'm going to create a function called createPost, and this function is going to accept the post data that we send to it. Now notice we have an error, cannot find attribute server. And the reason for this error is because when I set up the project, I set the full stack option to false. But we can easily fix this error by simply going over to cargo.toml and enabling the full stack feature. And so now we have full stack enabled, we should be able to continue with the code. Now before we implement the createPost server function, let's call it from the post button. Now remember that the server function is asynchronous, so we need to use the asynchronous keyword with the move keyword. But we still have an error, and that's because server functions need to return a result of a value that can be serializable and deserializable, and return an error of server FN error. So in this case, I'm going to just return an OK variant with no response. And because it's an asynchronous function, we need to await it. And also because it returns a result, we'll need to unwrap it. So now we just have to pass the post title and the post body to the createPost function, and then just update the function signature as well. And these two arguments are going to be passed as a string. Now before we continue any further, let's just go ahead and print these two values to the terminal just to make sure that the values are coming through. So if I enter a post title and a post body, we should see that displayed in the terminal. So that's working fine. Now the only thing that's left to do is save our post to a database, and for that we're going to use SQLite using the rustlang crate. So we're going to create a database table called post, and this table is going to consist of an ID, user ID, title, post body, and a created time. And the ID is going to be sequential, so that if we needed to edit or delete a post, we can do so. But we're not going to look at that in this video. The user ID, well, that's just there to identify the author of the post. But again, we're not going to look at that in this video, and I'm going to hard code the user ID when we insert a post into the table. So once we execute this SQL statement by running the app, we can then go ahead and delete this code and verify that the database has actually been created. So if I click on the post button, you should see that the create API has been called, and that should have generated the database file for us. And we can verify it by looking in the project explorer, and you can see that data.db3 has been created. So now we have a database. We can go ahead and delete the create statement and replace it with an insert statement to insert our post into the database. So we've now come to the point where we can enter a post, and I'm going to enter a post that I've generated using an AI tool. Now take note of the post description. You'll notice that I'm using line breaks, and that's important. We'll get back to that later. But for now, I'm going to save the post, and since we don't have a response back from the server indicating that the post has been saved, we'll look into the database file to confirm that the post has actually been saved. So we can see that the post has been saved. Now all we have to do is write a server function to receive a list of posts and show them in the post component. But before we do that, I'm going to set up a state to hold a vector of type post, so that when we fetch the post from the backend server, we can save those posts to this state. And here I'm creating a struct called post, and post will contain an ID field, a title field, a post body field, and a created time field. And I'm also going to derive debug, clone, and partial EQ. And we're going to use this struct to map the post data to each of the fields in the post struct. And now we can write a backend server function called getPost, and getPost will return a vector of type post. And I'm going to select the post by ID descending so that we can show the most recent post first. Now the prepare method will return a statement, and on that statement we can use the query map, because the query map will give us a row, and then we can map the data from the row to each of the fields in the post type. And finally, because rows is a mapped rows type, we need to iterate over it and add the post to a vector, and then we can return that vector. Now we have an error in the code. The trait bound post serialize is not satisfied, and so we need to add serialize and deserialize to our post type, and to do this we're going to install Serde. So now with Serde installed, we can add deserialize and serialize to the post type. But we still have an issue in the code, and if we look at the server macro, we can see the error message is private type post in public interface. So what that means is we need to make the post type public. So that fixes the error, and now we can call the getPostServer function in the main component, and we're going to do that by using Dioxus' useFuture hook. And this hook allows us to spawn a future using an asynchronous closure. Now, since the getPost function returns an array of posts, we're going to await it and unwrap it, and then we're going to add each of the posts into the post state that we created earlier using a for loop. So now we have a state that holds a vector of posts, and we're going to pass this state to the post component. And this component is just a wrapper, so we're going to iterate over the post once again, and this time for each post we're going to call the post component. And this is an individual component that's going to render each post. So I've just realized that there's an error in the code. So before continuing any further, let's go ahead and fix this error. So on line 200, you can see I'm using row.useSignal, but useSignal isn't a method on the row. So we need to change this to row.unwrap. And while we're here, I'm going to select only the columns that we need from the query, because if we select columns that are not part of the post type, we're going to get errors. Okay, so we can now go back to the post component, and in this component I'm going to add the post title, the post body, and the post created time. And with this small change, we should be able to see the list of posts on the home page. So let's go ahead and run the app just to make sure everything's working. And finally, our first post. But if you take a look at the post body, you'll notice that it isn't formatted correctly. And so what we'd like to do before we complete this video is to format the post body with at least some basic level of formatting. So I'm going to add another post, and this time I'm going to format the post body using a special character. And the character that I've chosen is the hash character. And so the idea is that we are going to prepend lines with 3 hashes for a large heading and 2 hashes for a small heading. So after saving the post, this is what it currently looks like, and you can see that it's not formatted correctly. So let's go and write some code to get this fixed, and hopefully it'll look a lot better. So we're going to fix this issue by creating a new component called postBody, and we're going to pass the postBody variable into this component. And then we're going to split the post body using the new line character and iterate over each of the lines. And for every line, we're going to check if that line starts with 3 hashes. Now let's pause on this code for a moment and realize that it's not entirely correct. The get method is returning a range of bytes, and if it doesn't exist, we're just returning an empty string. Now the problem there is that we could have a line that starts with 1 or 2 characters, and if that's the case, we still should return those 2 characters even if we don't match against the 3 hashes. But in this case, it's okay because an else statement will take care of lines where there's only 1 or 2 characters. And also take note of the call to unwrap. So the code here is likely to panic, and that's because we're selecting a range of bytes that might not be valid UTF-8. But for now, let's go ahead and continue writing the rest of the code. So we have 2 if statements. One to check if the line starts with 3 hashes, and if it does, we take the text and we wrap it around an h2 tag. And the other to check if the line starts with 2 hashes, and if it does, we wrap it around an h3 tag. And then finally, we have an else block where unmatched lines are going to be wrapped around a paragraph. And now we're ready to compile and run our app for the last time. And this is what the blog post looks like. Now, in the beginning of the video, I mentioned that I had intended to do development as well as deployment, but I changed my mind when I realized that Dioxus 0.6 uses Axiom 0.7. So I figured I'd wait until Dioxus started using Axiom 0.8 and then I'll make that video. But until that upgrade happens, we'll look at other ways to use Dioxus, and in the next video, hopefully we'll look at mobile development.